welcome to the deep dive. So, you sent us this really interesting source. It's an analysis that digs deep into the ethical side of the book of Exodus.
Yeah, the moral complexities.
Exactly. Think of this as like your fast track to understanding some of the real sticky issues in this foundational text.
And it's not just a quick look. This analysis we're using, it identifies something like 100 potential ethical problems or questions within Exodus.
Wow, 100.
Yeah. So if you're curious about the moral foundations, or maybe even the contradictions in this ancient story, well, we've got a lot to unpack.
And for you listening, maybe you want to grasp these key debates quickly or get a fresh angle or just, satisfy that curiosity. We're aiming to make this deep dive both efficient and hopefully really insightful.
We'll be looking at everything from divine actions that make you question fairness to laws from, well, a very different time.
Our source material actually gives us a pretty helpful roadmap. It groups these issues together.
Right. Things like divine commands and actions, laws and justice, moral behavior, leadership, social issues.
War and violence, religious practices, personal ethics, even a bit on environmental ethics and the challenges of interpretation.
And we'll finish up by touching on how some of this might even apply today.
So have you ever really stopped to think about the ethical tightropes in a text like Exodus? Today, we're diving into this analysis that unpacks not just the stories, but the whole moral landscape they present.
Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. Okay, starting with those moments that really make you think. Divine commands and actions. Our source kicks off with the 10 plagues, the sheer scale of them.
Yeah, and the first big question the analysis raises is about just punishment. You see this widespread death hitting the Egyptians, and you have to ask, was that fair for everyone, considering it was mainly the leaders doing the oppressing? It gets into that tricky idea of collective responsibility.
It really does. You think about all the ordinary Egyptians who probably had nothing to do with the enslavement directly, and then the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn.
That one hits hard. It brings up the idea of proportionality and divine justice really sharply.
How so?
Well, even if you accept the premise of a divine response to oppression is killing all the firstborn, including children, a proportionate response, that's tough to square with modern ethics.
It really is. Very hard to grapple with.
Yeah.
Then there's the whole thing with Pharaoh's heart being hardened.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting regarding free will.
Right.
If God is actively involved in making Pharaoh resistant, how much real moral choice does Pharaoh actually have? It's, a classic theological debate, divine control versus human responsibility.
It almost feels like a setup sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And speaking of actions that feel, well, ambiguous, what about telling the Israelites to borrow valuables from the Egyptians?
Without intending to return them, yeah. Exodus 3:11-12. It's right there.
So what did the analysis say?
Well, it's presented as a major sticking point. On the surface, it looks like deception, plain and simple. The analysis asks directly, is this ethical?
Tricky.
You could argue, maybe, context of slavery, reclaiming lost wages.
Yep.
But the method itself, it feels uncomfortable. It definitely blurs the lines.
Yeah, it really does. Moving on, the source also flags God's apparent favoritism towards Israel.
The chosen people idea. It's common in foundational texts, but the analysis pushes us to think about fairness. What does preferential treatment for one group imply about how others are viewed or treated?
Raises questions about universality, impartiality, things like that.
Exactly. And then the golden calf, a very famous story.
Right. Big reaction to idolatry there.
Huge reaction, divine wrath, major punishment for the Israelites involved. And the ethical question the analysis poses is, was the punishment proportional to the offense? Was that level of retribution justified?
It's certainly a dramatic response. And it's not the only instance of strictness, is it? The Sabbath laws.
Oh, yeah. Death penalty for breaking the Sabbath.
From our viewpoint today, that feels incredibly severe, working on a Saturday.
It just highlights how different their legal and social world was. Really underscores the gap.
It does. Even the laws about sacrifice, which were central to their worship.
They don't escape scrutiny either. The analysis subtly raises questions about, say, animal rights from a modern perspective. The whole idea of animal sacrifice for atonement can feel, well, jarring now. It prompts questions about animal welfare and the ethics behind it.
And I guess all these points, the plagues, the hardening, the deception, favoritism, punishments, they all feed into this larger theme the analysis identifies. The ethical challenge of divine violence in these narratives.
Precisely. It's a thread running through this whole section. Okay, so with that as a backdrop, let's shift to how the source looks at the laws and justice laid out in Exodus.
Right, and the analysis jumps right into a big one, slavery laws.
Yeah, and it's crucial to state up front, as the analysis does, that from our modern ethical viewpoint, slavery is just inherently wrong. Full stop.
Of course.
So while Exodus has rules about how to practice it, the basic injustice of owning another person is still the core ethical problem here.
And it makes you ask, even within that ancient system, were the rules for treating slaves in Exodus? Well, were they humane enough? It's hard to say.
Very difficult. The analysis also points to pretty significant gender inequality baked into many laws.
A patriarchal society, basically.
Clearly, which understandably raises red flags today about women's rights and their status under that legal code.
And it seems it wasn't just about gender roles. The source notes places where the laws themselves seem to favor certain groups.
Yeah, what jumps out is the observation that laws sometimes seem skewed towards the wealthy or powerful,
Okay.
which immediately makes you ask about fairness. Did the system really treat everyone equally, especially the vulnerable?
Then we had that famous phrase, eye for an eye, lex talionis.
Right. Now, you could argue it was maybe meant to limit retaliation, prevent blood feuds from escalating endlessly.
Okay, like keep proportional in a way.
Perhaps. But the analysis points out that through a modern lens, it still feels pretty harsh. We tend to think more about rehabilitation or restorative justice now.
Absolutely. And the fact that capital punishment pops up for so many different offenses in Exodus, that also feels very different today.
Yeah, it raises fundamental questions about the death penalty itself, its morality, its effectiveness. It's a debate still happening now, isn't it?
For sure. The source also looks at laws around responsibility for accidents.
These give us a fascinating glimpse into how they dealt with unintentional harm. The analysis makes us think about how fair their systems were for assigning blame and deciding on compensation when accidents happened.
And it seems sometimes property rights might have been prioritized over, say, human well-being.
There are examples in the laws where protecting property seems to be the main focus, maybe even at the expense of individuals in certain situations. Tells you something about their values.
Which circles back to a key question. Did the legal system in Exodus really provide justice for the poor?
The analysis specifically asks that. Did the laws adequately protect the rights of the poor, the marginalized? It's a timeless challenge, seeing it right there in these ancient texts.
And finally, on laws, the source mentions inheritance rules.
Yeah, specifically pointing out how daughters, for instance, could be at a significant disadvantage. Again, reinforcing that patriarchal structure and its impact.
Okay, so we've covered divine actions and the legal system. Let's turn to individual moral behavior, as the source highlights it. Starting with Moses himself, he wasn't perfect.
No, and that's actually quite insightful, seeing the human flaws in even the most revered figures, Moses' anger, like when he broke the tablets.
Yeah.
It makes you think about leadership ethics, emotional control, especially under pressure. What do we expect from our leaders?
And then there was that time he disobeyed God, striking the rock for water.
Right, hitting it twice when he was told to speak to it. And the fact that he faced consequences for that, it really drives home the theme of accountability.
Even for him?
Even for Moses. Nobody's above the rules, apparently.
Aaron also gets looked at critically in the analysis, particularly his role with the golden calf.
His complicity there, basically giving in to the people's demands, is framed as a serious moral failure. It asks questions about leadership under pressure, standing up for principles even when it's unpopular.
And what about the Israelites themselves? Their constant complaining.
Yeah. The analysis suggests their grumbling and lack of faith, even after seeing miracles, is kind of a mirror to human nature itself.
Interesting.
Makes you reflect on our own tendencies towards doubt or ingratitude, perhaps.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
The source also brings up the idea of fear of God as a moral motivator.
This is a complex one. Reverence, awe, sure, that can influence behavior, but is fear alone a healthy or sufficient basis for ethics?
Good question.
Does it lead to genuine moral understanding or just, towing the line because you're scared?
That's really interesting. What about lying and deception in the narrative? Sometimes it sounds like it's for a good cause.
The analysis points out very sharply that even if the intent behind deception seems good, it's still an ethical problem. The classic ends justify the means dilemma. Can they?
A timeless puzzle, which leads to the bigger theme of moral responsibility.
Right. The source encourages us to think about that balance. How much are we individually accountable versus, say, the influence of divine will or the pressures of society at the time? How much real agency do people have?
And that tension between justice and mercy comes up again here, doesn't it?
Definitely. You see examples of strict justice, but also moments of divine mercy throughout Exodus. It paints a complex picture, sometimes even seemingly contradictory, of the divine character and how it deals with human flaws.
And connected to that is forgiveness and repentance.
The analysis asks, what does it take to be forgiven? What counts as real repentance? It seems to suggest it's got to be more than just saying sorry. Maybe a deeper change is needed.
And finally, in this moral behavior section, the source looks at how sin is defined in Exodus.
Yeah, it pushes us to consider, are certain acts wrong in and of themselves, always? Or is their sinfulness tied specifically to the cultural and religious rules of that time and place?
Lots to think about there. Okay, let's move into leadership and authority as our source examines it. Moses is obviously key here.
Right, and the analysis starts by looking at the scope of his authority. He wasn't just a political leader, he was this mediator between God and the people. Understanding the limits and nature of his power is really important for judging his actions.
And that advice he got from Jethro about delegating.
Yes, Jethro's advice is presented as ethically smart: share the load, delegate authority. It highlights the benefits of distributing power, preventing burnout, maybe even creating a fairer system.
So what kind of qualities does Exodus seem to value in a good leader?
Well, the analysis suggests Exodus makes us ask that question implicitly. Is it about strict obedience to God, inspiring people, managing conflicts? Probably a mix. And then, are those qualities universal? Would they work today?
The source also acknowledges the potential for power to be abused, right?
Yeah.
Even by someone divinely appointed like Moses.
Absolutely crucial point. The fact that even God's chosen leaders can mess up or make questionable choices is a warning sign about the risks that always come with authority.
And who are they accountable to?
Primarily to God, it seems, within the Exodus framework. But the analysis points out that their failures hit the people they lead hard, so there's definitely a question of responsibility to the community, too.
The role of prophets comes up too, speaking truth to power.
Yeah, figures like Aaron sometimes had this moral duty to speak honestly, even if it was difficult or unpopular with those in charge. It underscores the ethical weight on those claiming to speak for a higher power.
And the handover from Moses to Joshua. Any ethical angles there?
The analysis makes us think about the ethics of succession. How do you ensure a smooth transition? Pick the right person. What does it mean for the community's future?
What about when human orders clash with what people believe is divine law? Where does obedience stop?
Exodus has moments like that. It forces you to confront those fundamental questions about the limits of obeying human authority versus following your conscience or a higher law.
And how power is divided up: religious, political, judicial.
The analysis touches on that balance within Israelite society as depicted. How's authority shared? Are there checks and balances? Important questions for any group.
And finally, for leaders, the importance of setting a moral example.
Definitely. Leaders influence others by their actions. The analysis suggests Exodus really highlights this ethical need for those in charge to embody the values they expect from everyone else.
Okay, let's shift gears to social and community issues. The whole Exodus story starts with freeing an oppressed group.
Exactly. It's fundamentally about liberation from slavery. So the analysis rightly pulls out this enduring ethical principle, the need to fight suffering and injustice. It's baked into the narrative itself.
How does Exodus talk about treating foreigners or aliens living among them?
There are laws about it, but the analysis asks, do these laws promote real inclusion, real equality, or is there still a distinction, a lower status for the outsider?
And what about the community's responsibility for individuals and vice versa?
The analysis explores that idea of shared fate. How much is the group accountable for one person's actions? How much does the individual owe the community? It's about mutual obligation.
What's the concept of social justice like in Exodus?
The analysis tries to define it based on the text. How is fairness implemented? Do the laws and structures actually create equity for everyone?
Economic differences seem to exist even then.
Yes. The source points out economic inequality and asks whether the laws do enough to address it to support those who are struggling financially.
Caring for the vulnerable widows, orphans that seems common in ancient law codes.
Absolutely. The analysis highlights this specific duty placed on the community in Exodus. It's a basic ethical requirement. Protect those who can't protect themselves.
And the family unit. Obviously important.
Hugely important. The analysis stresses the ethical duties within families, parents, children, siblings, all having obligations to each other.
Hospitality, too. Welcoming strangers.
Another value the analysis picks up on, an ethical call to welcome and care for travelers or those far from home.
How do they handle disputes within the community?
The source looks at the methods shown in Exodus and asks, were they fair? Were they effective in getting just results for everyone involved?
And finally here, that constant tension. Individual freedom versus keeping social order.
Yeah, every society grapples with this. Exodus, through its stories and laws, gives us glimpses into where they drew the line and the ethics involved in trying to keep things together while respecting personal liberty.
Okay, now for a potentially tougher area, war and violence in Exodus.
Yeah, this is definitely complex. The analysis starts right at the beginning. When, if ever, is war morally justified according to the principles in Exodus?
And if it is deemed justified, are there rules for how it should be fought?
The analysis looks for that. Are there rules of engagement? Crucially, do these rules protect non-combatants, women, children, the elderly? That's a huge ethical benchmark for any conflict.
What about the spoils of war? How they're divided up?
That raises ethical questions too. Is the distribution fair? Does it just create more inequality?
How are enemies treated during and after the fighting?
Exodus gives some indications, and the analysis prompts us to reflect on the ethical standards. Is there mercy, restraint, or is it mostly about retribution?
The idea that God commands war is especially troubling for many people today.
Absolutely. A divine mandate for warfare creates significant ethical problems. The analysis really challenges us to wrestle with the implications of God endorsing violence.
Is violence shown as a last resort in Exodus?
That's a key question the analysis asks. Is it something only turned to when all else fails? Or is it sometimes used preemptively, maybe even aggressively?
And even if war is somehow justified, there's the question of how much violence is used.
Proportionality, right.
Or is-
Is the level of violence depicted proportionate to the offense or the goal? That's a core principle of just war thinking.
The whole cycle of revenge and retribution.
It's a constant theme in conflict. The analysis makes us ask whether Exodus promotes that cycle or if it offers ways towards justice that aren't just about getting even.
And while the actual conquest happens later in books like Joshua, it flows directly from Exodus, doesn't it?
Yes, and the analysis points out the huge ethical issues there. Land rights, displacing people already living there, the morality of taking territory by force, even with a perceived divine backing.
Finally, on violence, the source reminds us about the long-term effects.
War's impact lasts for generations. The analysis prompts us to consider those lasting scars on individuals, communities, and the potential for ongoing conflict.
Okay, let's move to religious practices and rituals now as our source outlines them. The ban on idolatry is huge.
Absolutely central. But the analysis pushes us to think about the implications. Does this strong prohibition automatically lead to intolerance of other beliefs?
What about building the tabernacle, the sacred tent? Ethical aspects there.
Yeah, the creation of the sacred space. The analysis raises questions about, the ethics of defining spaces as holy, the resources involved, maybe even how it creates hierarchies or divisions.
And the priests, their role and responsibilities.
They hold a lot of religious power in Exodus. The analysis rightly flags the potential for misusing that authority and the ethical duties that come with it.
Religious festivals are important in many traditions.
The analysis asks us to think about their purpose and ethical meaning in Exodus. What values do they reinforce? Who benefits?
Sacrifice for atonement. We touched on this a bit with animals.
Right. The whole system, relying on animal offerings, raises those ethical questions about atonement itself and whether it aligns with modern feelings about animal welfare.
What about the laws on ritual purity and impurity?
The analysis questions if these laws, whatever their symbolic meaning, end up discriminating against or excluding certain people based on their ritual status.
The covenant, the agreement between God and Israel, is key theologically.
And ethically, too. The analysis highlights it as a deal with obligations on both sides. Understanding those duties is vital for grasping the moral framework.
How do the specific religious laws in Exodus relate to maybe more universal moral ideas?
The source encourages that comparison. Do the specific rules align with broader ethical principles that might apply beyond just this group? Do they sometimes clash?
Are the Ten Commandments enough for a complete ethical system?
They're foundational, obviously, but the analysis prompts us to ask, do they cover everything? Are they sufficient guidance for all the complex moral choices people face?
And lastly here, the emphasis on remembering the past. especially the Exodus event itself.
That act of remembering is presented as key to shaping moral identity. The idea seems to be that recalling their liberation should embed values like justice and compassion.
Okay, let's get into personal ethics as the source outlines it. Starts with honesty.
Pretty fundamental, right? The analysis highlights its importance in Exodus. Truthfulness is the basis for trust and fair dealing.
And respecting the dignity and rights of everyone.
Yeah, the ethical duty to recognize the inherent worth of each person, no matter their background or status.
Personal responsibility comes up again.
Taking ownership of your actions and their consequences. The analysis stresses this individual accountability.
Compassion and empathy seem vital too.
Understanding and sharing others' feelings, especially those suffering, is presented as crucial for ethical living.
Gratitude and humility are also mentioned.
Recognizing good things, appreciating them, and not getting too puffed up about your own importance, seen as key parts of moral character.
Self-control, discipline.
The analysis points to the need to manage impulses, resist doing wrong, and cultivate the discipline to do right.
And faith and trust in God are seen as shaping character.
Within the Exodus context, yes, faith is presented as influencing moral choices and commitment to ethical living.
Holiness too. What does that mean ethically?
Striving for holiness seems to involve a commitment to moral purity, trying to live up to divine standards.
What about inner thoughts versus outward actions? Does one matter more?
The analysis suggests Exodus cares about both. Actions are obviously important, but inner motives and intentions seem to matter too.
And finally, just how moral character is built or grown.
The analysis prompts reflection on that process according to the principles and stories within Exodus.
Now, for a lens that's maybe more modern, environmental ethics in relation to Exodus.
Yeah, and interpretations here can differ. The analysis starts by asking, does Exodus suggest a kind of stewardship of the earth? It's not framed in modern eco terms, but are there hints of a responsibility to care for creation?
Is there concern for animals shown?
The analysis notes laws that do address animal treatment, suggesting some level of concern for their welfare, even amidst practices like sacrifice or farming.
Any principles that lean towards sustainable living?
Again, not a concept they had then. But the analysis invites us to look for underlying ideas maybe about balance, not overusing resources that might resonate with sustainability today.
What about the land being a sacred gift?
If the land is seen as divinely given, does that imply a duty to treat it respectfully, not just exploit it? The analysis suggests making that connection.
And how does Exodus seem to balance human needs with environmental concerns, if at all?
The analysis encourages exploring whether Exodus offers any kind of framework for meeting human needs while still respecting the natural world.
Okay, finally, we get to interpretational challenges. Super important when reading ancient texts.
Absolutely critical. The analysis stresses understanding the original context, historical, cultural. What did this stuff mean then?
And the fact that our own moral understanding evolves over time.
Right. How does that change how we read and apply texts like Exodus today? The analysis forces us to confront that.
We also have to admit there isn't just one way to read Exodus.
No single correct interpretation. The analysis highlights the reality of diverse, sometimes conflicting readings, and why it's important to acknowledge them.
And just taking ancient laws and applying them directly today, that's hard.
Very hard. The analysis specifically addresses the difficulty of mapping laws from thousands of years ago onto our complex modern world.
The danger of cherry-picking verses too.
Huge danger. Just grabbing bits that fit your view while ignoring others gives a skewed picture. The analysis warns strongly against that.
Bridging the gap between their cultural norms and our ethics.
That's maybe the central challenge, grappling with those differences in values and moral framework.
What about balancing tradition versus our own reason when making ethical choices based on these texts?
Yeah, how much weight do we give to tradition versus our own moral reasoning and intuition? The analysis raises that fundamental question.
And the whole question of biblical authority and ethics. How much authority should it have?
The analysis touches on that complex debate. To what extent should Exodus, or the Bible generally, be the final word on ethics?
Divine command theory. The idea that morality is just what God commands gets a brief mention too.
Yeah, basing ethics solely on divine commands has its own set of philosophical and ethical issues, which the analysis acknowledges.
And finally here, how Exodus itself deals with the existence of evil and suffering.
It doesn't offer easy answers, but Exodus definitely confronts the reality of bad things happening. It gives us narratives and perspectives that people still debate and explore today.
Which brings us neatly to modern applications. How can this ancient stuff still matter to us?
Well, the analysis suggests looking at the social justice themes liberation, care for the oppressed. Can those principles inform how we tackle poverty, inequality, discrimination today? Those themes still feel powerful.
How might it shape our view of human rights?
By looking at the emphasis on dignity, the fight for freedom in Exodus, we can maybe see connections to modern ideas about universal human rights and the value of every person.
And environmental ethics.
As we said, maybe not explicit, but ideas of stewardship or connection to the land in Exodus could offer perspectives for today's environmental challenges.
Can it be useful in dialogue between different faiths?
Since it's foundational for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Exodus can be a shared text to explore common ethical ground, maybe foster understanding between traditions.
And finally, what about for us as individuals? Personal growth, spiritual development.
Engaging with these tough moral questions in Exodus can challenge us, make us reflect on our own values, our responsibilities, maybe lead to some personal transformation or a deeper sense of purpose.
Wow. Well, as our source material makes incredibly clear, the book of Exodus is so much more than just an old story. It's packed with these complex ethical, moral issues that, well, people are clearly still thinking about and debating thousands of years later.
Definitely.
This deep dive, it's really just scratched the surface of what the analysis covers. But hopefully, for you listening, it gives a useful framework for understanding these ancient dilemmas and maybe seeing their echoes in our world today.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating when you step back and look at all these different moral knots within Exodus is what it tells us about ethical debate itself, how it endures, and also the challenges we always face trying to interpret these foundational texts across such huge gaps in time and culture.
That's a great point. The dilemmas they wrestled with back then, they still feel relevant, don't they? That ongoing struggle to figure out right and wrong, justice and mercy.
It keeps going.
Exactly. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We really hope it's giving you plenty to mull over.